a seemingly perfect couple whose relationship descended into darkness, control, and eventually a tragic end. This case, which involves obsession, betrayal, and a chilling act of violence, serves as a reminder that what appears perfect on the outside can hide unimaginable suffering within. We'll uncover the layers of this heartbreaking story, adding even more details about Becky and Tim's lives, the struggles they faced, and how those struggles ultimately led to a night that ended in tragedy. Let's take you back to the very beginning, to Quincy University, a small, picturesque college where Becky and Tim first met. Their story started in the most common of ways. Two students crossing paths on campus, each with their own dreams and goals, unknowingly on a collision course that would change both of their lives forever. Becky was a standout from the moment she arrived at Quincy. She had always been ambitious, driven not only by her academic pursuits, but also by her love for sports. Becky was the kind of person who didn't just excel in the classroom, she also dominated on the tennis court. She balanced her studies with her athletic commitments effortlessly, or so it seemed to those who admired her from afar. Her friends would often say that Becky had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the world when she was speaking to you. Her presence was magnetic, but what really drew people to Becky was her personality. She was warm, approachable, and had a smile that could light up any room, and she quickly became a beloved figure on campus. Then there was Tim. Tall, athletic, and charming, Tim was the kind of guy who could walk into a room and instantly become the centre of attention. He was the star of the football team, an All-American with a promising future ahead of him. But it wasn't just his athleticism that made Tim stand out. It was his fun-loving personality. Tim was the kind of person who could turn a serious moment into a laugh, who could take the edge off any tense situation with a well-timed joke. He had a way of putting people at ease, of making them feel like they were part of something special. His friends loved him for his goofy nature, his infectious laughter, and his ability to see the lighter side of life. When Becky and Tim met, it felt like fate. They seemed to complement each other perfectly. Becky's grace and intelligence, paired with Tim's energy and charm, created a couple that everyone admired. They quickly became inseparable, spending their days studying together, attending college events, and of course, supporting each other in their respective sports. From the outside looking in, their relationship seemed perfect. Two attractive, successful individuals who had found love in the most natural of ways. Their friends used to say that Becky and Tim were the kind of couple that gave you hope, that made you believe in the power of love. After 2 years of dating, Becky and Tim decided to get married. It was a big step, but to those who knew them, it seemed like the natural next chapter in their love story. They had spent the last few years building a strong foundation, and now they were ready to take the plunge into a life together. Their wedding wasn't a flashy affair. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Becky and Tim had always been practical people, more focused on building a stable future than on spending money on fleeting moments. Instead of a grand wedding or an extravagant honeymoon, they chose to save their money and put it toward a down payment on their first home. To their friends and family, this decision made perfect sense. Becky and Tim had always been focused on the future, on creating a life together that would stand the test of time. They didn't need the pomp and circumstance of a big wedding to prove their love for each other. What mattered most to them was the life they were building, a life centered around their shared goals, their love for each other, and, eventually, their desire to start a family. For Becky, marriage meant more than just a new chapter in her love story. It was also a time of self-reflection. Before meeting Tim, Becky had always dreamed of becoming a doctor. She had a deep passion for medicine, for helping others, and for making a difference in the world. But as her relationship with Tim deepened, and the prospect of starting a family became more real, Becky's priorities began to shift. While she still had a love for medicine, she realised that her true calling was motherhood. When Becky and Tim welcomed their first son, it was as if everything in her life fell into place. She had found her purpose in life, to be a mother. And as their family grew with the addition of 2 more sons, Becky's happiness only deepened. She embraced the role of mother with open arms, dedicating herself fully to raising her boys. Every moment with them was precious, from the early morning wake-ups to the late-night feedings. For Becky, there was nothing more fulfilling than watching her boys grow and thrive under her care. Tim, too, seemed to embrace his role as a father, at least in the beginning. He adored his sons and enjoyed the time they spent together. But as the years went on, Tim's enthusiasm for fatherhood began to wane. He became more focused on his own pursuits, leaving much of the parenting responsibilities to Becky. While Becky thrived in her role as a mother, Tim became increasingly distant, often choosing to spend time with his friends or at work rather than helping out at home. As the boys grew older and became more independent, Becky began to feel the familiar pull of her earlier dreams. She had put her own ambitions on hold for years to focus on raising her children, but now that they were older, she felt it was time to return to school and pursue a career in nursing. Nursing, she believed, would allow her to combine her love for helping others with the flexibility to still be there for her family. It was a decision that Becky didn't take lightly. She knew it would be a challenge to balance school, work and family, but she was ready for it. After all, she had always been someone who could handle anything life threw at her. Her friends were supportive, encouraging her to follow her dreams and reminding her that it was okay to focus on herself for once. But Tim didn't see it that way. He was opposed to Becky's decision from the start, citing concerns about how the stress of nursing school would affect her and their family. On the surface, it seemed like Tim was worried about Becky's well-being, but those closest to Becky began to see his true motivations. Tim didn't like the idea of Becky becoming more independent. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions, and Becky's newfound desire to pursue her own career threatened that dynamic. As Becky threw herself into her studies, the cracks in their marriage began to show. Tim became more controlling, more resentful of Becky's growing independence. He would make snide comments about how she was neglecting her family, how she wasn't the same person she used to be. But Becky knew that she wasn't neglecting anyone. She was simply trying to create a better life for herself and her children. Still, the tension between them continued to build. Becky found herself juggling school, work, and the responsibilities of running a household, while Tim refused to contribute. He left all of the parenting duties to Becky, often disappearing for hours or even days at a time without explanation. Becky was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she refused to give up on her dreams. She knew that getting her nursing degree would allow her to provide a better future for her boys, and that was what kept her going. As the months went by, it became clear to Becky that her marriage was falling apart. The man she had once loved so deeply was now a stranger to her, someone who seemed more interested in controlling her than in building a life together. Becky suggested marriage counselling, hoping that they could work through their issues and find a way back to each other. But Tim refused. He dismissed the idea, claiming that they didn't need outside help to fix their problems. In his mind, the problem wasn't their relationship, it was Becky. By January 2021, after 11 years of marriage, Tim made the decision to file for divorce. It was a devastating blow to Becky, who had fought so hard to keep the family together. She had been willing to do whatever it took to save their marriage, but now it was clear that Tim had no interest in reconciliation. He moved out of the family home and into a house across town, leaving Becky to pick up the pieces of their broken life. Tim claimed that the reason for the divorce was simple. Becky had changed. He said that her nursing career had taken a toll on her personality, making her distant, irritable, and no longer the woman he had married. But Becky's friends knew the truth. They had watched Tim become increasingly controlling and manipulative over the years, and they believed that the real reason for the divorce was Tim's inability to handle Becky's independence. As the divorce proceedings dragged on, Becky became increasingly fearful for her safety. One of her co-workers had been murdered by her partner in a domestic violence incident, and the tragedy hit close to home for Becky. She began to worry that Tim could become violent, especially as his behaviour grew more erratic and controlling. In a series of chilling text messages to her sister, Becky expressed her fear that Tim might harm her. "If anything happens to me," she wrote, "Tim will be the first person you should look at." Her sister, alarmed by Becky's words, urged her to seek help from a domestic violence resource centre, Eventually, Becky did file her own order of protection against him, claiming that he had entered her home without permission and manipulated their interactions to make her look like the aggressor. Despite the seriousness of the situation, a judge reviewing the orders of protection declined to grant either one. The court ordered that Becky and Tim stay away from each other's homes, except when exchanging custody of their children. But this legal order did little to alleviate Becky's fears. She knew that Tim was capable of much more than just manipulation and control. In February 2023, just 1 week before their divorce was set to be finalised, Becky's worst fears were realised. On the night of February 22nd, their 3 sons were spending the night at Tim's house. The following day, when Becky failed to pick them up from school, Tim contacted her father expressing concern. This was highly unusual for Becky, who was known for her punctuality and dedication to her children. Becky's father immediately knew that something was wrong and drove to her house to check on her. When he arrived, the house was eerily quiet. He called out Becky's name, but received no response. His heart raced as he made his way upstairs, fearing the worst. What he found in Becky's bedroom confirmed his deepest fears. Becky was lying motionless on the floor, covered in blood. She had been shot multiple times, and it was clear that she had been dead for hours. The police arrived soon after, and the investigation into Becky's murder began. Forensic teams scoured the house for evidence, and it wasn't long before they found signs of a forced entry. The bedroom door had been kicked in, and there were clear signs that Becky had tried to barricade herself inside the room, using furniture to block the door. As they pieced together the events of the night, detectives found Becky's phone lying near her body. She had attempted to dial 911, but in her panic, she had misdialed the number. It was a tragic mistake, one that had cost Becky her life. The investigators theorized that Becky had been chased through the house by her killer, who had forced their way into the bedroom and ultimately cornered her in the bathroom. The brutality of the crime left no doubt in their minds that this was a personal attack. Someone had come to Becky's house with the intention of killing her. Becky's father stood frozen in the doorway, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding in front of him. His daughter, his bright, vibrant daughter, was no longer the woman he had known. Her lifeless body, marred by gunshot wounds, lay in a pool of blood that stained the floor. The warmth of Becky's smile, the sound of her laughter, the simple joy of watching her with her children, was now gone. His knees buckled under the weight of the tragedy, and his shaking hands barely managed to dial the emergency number. His voice, usually strong and commanding, was a mere whisper, cracking under the strain of grief as he tried to explain what he had found. The police arrived quickly, but for Becky's father, time seemed to stretch on forever. Every minute he waited for the authorities to take control felt like an eternity. He paced outside the house, his mind swirling with unanswered questions, his heart shattered into pieces. The image of Becky lying on the floor, her blood staining the hardwood, her once beautiful face pale and devoid of life. As detectives and forensic investigators descended on the scene, the house was transformed into a flurry of activity. Yellow crime scene tape marked the perimeter, sealing off the once welcoming home as a place of unspeakable tragedy. Flashing lights illuminated the darkened street, and the quiet hum of the neighbourhood was replaced by the sounds of police radios, the low murmur of investigators discussing the case, and the mechanical clicks of cameras capturing the grim evidence. Detectives entered the house cautiously, their eyes scanning every inch of the crime scene for clues that might point to the identity of Becky's killer. Immediately they were struck by the violence of the attack. The door to the bedroom had been kicked in, the wood splintered and cracked, a testament to the force used to gain entry. Becky had clearly tried to protect herself. Furniture had been pushed against the door in a desperate attempt to block the intruder's path. But it hadn't been enough. The killer had made their way through the barricade, determined to carry out their deadly plan. In the bathroom, where Becky's body lay, investigators noted the chaos that marked her final moments. The bathroom door had been broken open, suggesting that Becky had fled there in a last-ditch effort to escape. Blood spatter on the walls indicated that the attack had been swift and brutal. The sheer number of gunshot wounds, 8 in total, painted a picture of rage, of someone who had not simply wanted Becky dead, but who had wanted to destroy her completely. As the forensic team carefully collected evidence, they noted several key pieces that would later become critical to solving the case. First, there were the 8-9mm shell casings scattered across the bathroom floor, clear indicators of the weapon used in the murder. Each casing was meticulously bagged and labelled, ready to be sent to the crime lab for analysis. The second crucial discovery was the shredded plastic found near Becky's body. At first glance, it appeared insignificant, just small fragments of plastic, easily overlooked. But to the trained eyes of the investigators, it was clear that this plastic had a purpose. The detectives hypothesized that the killer had used the plastic, likely from a grocery bag, as a makeshift silencer for the gun. By placing the bag over the muzzle, the killer would have been able to muffle the sound of the shots, explaining why none of Becky's neighbours had reported hearing gunfire. It was a crude but effective method, one that suggested a level of planning and premeditation. Whoever had done this had not acted on impulse. They had come to Becky's house with the intent to kill. The plastic fragments were carefully bagged as evidence and sent to the lab for further analysis. The forensic team also found traces of gunpowder on Becky's hands, indicating that she had been in close proximity to the weapon when it was fired. This led detectives to believe that Becky had tried to fight back in her final moments, struggling to wrestle the gun away from her attacker. But despite her best efforts, she had been overpowered. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began canvassing the neighbourhood, speaking with Becky's neighbours in the hopes of finding someone who had seen or heard something that could provide a lead. Many of Becky's neighbours were shocked by the news of her murder, describing her as a kind, loving mother who had never caused any trouble. But as they spoke with the residents, the detectives learned something that raised their suspicions. Several of Becky's neighbours mentioned that they had seen a strange figure lurking around her property in the days leading up to the murder. One neighbour in particular had a security camera mounted on the side of their house. The camera faced the shared driveway between their home and Becky's, and it was equipped with motion sensors that triggered recording whenever movement was detected. The night before Becky's murder, at precisely 1:05 a.m, the camera had captured a figure walking down the driveway toward the back of Becky's house. The person was dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood, making it impossible to identify them. The figure disappeared from view for nearly an hour before reappearing, walking in the opposite direction, away from Becky's house. The timing was suspicious, and detectives began to wonder if this person had been scoping out Becky's home. Further review of the footage revealed that this wasn't the first time the mysterious figure had been seen near Becky's property. A week earlier, on February 14th, the camera had captured a similar incident. On that night, the figure had been seen loitering near Becky's backyard. Becky's neighbour had mentioned the sighting to her at the time, but Becky had brushed it off, saying she hadn't seen anyone herself. However, she did mention hearing strange noises in her backyard the night before. Noises that had made her uneasy, but that she had ultimately dismissed. Now, with the knowledge of what had happened to Becky, the eerie sightings of the hooded figure took on a far more sinister meaning. Detectives began to suspect that the person seen in the footage was none other than Becky's killer, someone who had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. But who was this person? And what motive could they have had for wanting Becky dead? As detectives delved deeper into Becky's life, they couldn't ignore the obvious suspect, Tim Bank, Becky's estranged husband. From the outside, Becky and Tim had once appeared to be the perfect couple. They were college sweethearts, two people who seemed destined to be together. But as detectives spoke with Becky's friends and family, a different picture began to emerge. A picture of a man who had become increasingly controlling as the years went by. Becky had confided in her closest friends that Tim had grown resentful of her independence, particularly after she decided to go back to school and pursue a career in nursing. According to those who knew the couple, Tim had always been the dominant one in the relationship. He had made the decisions, he had controlled the finances, and he had expected Becky to fall in line with his expectations. But when Becky began to carve out a life for herself outside of their marriage, Tim's behaviour became more volatile. He didn't like that Becky was no longer dependent on him, that she had ambitions and goals that didn't involve him. The once loving husband had become someone Becky feared, someone she believed was capable of great harm. With this information in hand, detectives turned their attention to Tim. When they questioned him, Tim appeared cooperative, expressing shock and sadness over Becky's death. He claimed that their divorce, while contentious, had not been particularly unusual, and he denied having any involvement in her murder, but detectives were not convinced. The timing of Becky's death, coupled with the reports of Tim's controlling behaviour, made him their prime suspect. Armed with a search warrant, detectives entered Tim's home, hoping to find evidence that would link him to the crime. Tim, for his part, continued to cooperate, standing outside as detectives searched through his belongings. But as they dug deeper into Tim's life, they uncovered several pieces of evidence that raised red flags. In the basement of Tim's house, detectives found a bike, one that matched the description of the bike seen in the security camera footage from Becky's neighbourhood. The detectives also found a crowbar in Tim's basement, which they believed may have been used to pry open the window at Becky's house on the night of the murder. Forensic analysis showed microscopic consistencies between the crowbar and the pry marks on Becky's window, but the evidence wasn't conclusive. Still, the presence of the bike, combined with the crowbar, suggested that Tim had been near Becky's house at the time of the murder. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was found on Tim's phone. Detectives uncovered a series of internet searches that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. In the days leading up to Becky's murder, Tim had searched for terms like how to open a door with a crowbar, how to make a homemade pistol silencer, how to clean gunpowder off your hands, and average police response time in Quincy. These searches, combined with the evidence found at the crime scene, gave detectives enough reason to arrest Tim on suspicion of murder. Despite the circumstantial evidence, the prosecution faced significant challenges in their case against Tim. There was no direct evidence linking him to the crime, no confession, no eyewitnesses, and no DNA. The shredded plastic bags, the shell casings, the bike, while all compelling pieces of evidence, weren't enough on their own to guarantee a conviction. Forensic experts testified that Tim's DNA could not be excluded from the DNA found under Becky's fingernails, and ballistics experts confirmed that the shell casings found at the scene matched those recovered from Tim's home. But the prosecution knew that they needed more to secure a guilty verdict. They needed to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Tim had not only planned Becky's murder, but had carried it out with cold-blooded precision. During the 6-day trial, the prosecution laid out its case, presenting the evidence they had painstakingly gathered over the course of the investigation. They painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and control. Tim, they argued, had carefully planned Becky's murder, using the plastic bags to silence the gunshots and ensuring that there were no witnesses to his crime. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning with a verdict: guilty. Tim Buck was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Becky's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but the pain of losing her would never truly fade.